Yes, and welcome back. And we are ready for another sprint of a panel discussion. Again, looking into a specific challenge. We have now changed the panelist. Not you, Anders. We need your expertise once again. But again, we will look into a challenge about crowd sensing data to support healthy, livable cities that is being presented to us from Aarhus in Denmark. And again, a group of municipalities have joined forces on this project, and it has been funded by Nordic Innovation Fund. But let me do the introduction of the panel. First, we have Vinay, who's working for Leapcraft. Is leading the urban tech company Leapcraft. Leapcraft has been involved for a number of years in the crossroad between environment, city policies, and smart cities. It is a design company focused on technology development, and they have been involved in mapping both shipping routes, healthcare data, and bicycle traffic. Next up is Oliver Schulze, who's a partner in Schulze+Grassov. Schulze+Grassov have been involved in a long range of projects in Denmark and abroad, from the city strategy for the city of Copenhagen to public space projects, master plans for Berlin, St. Louis, Moscow, and London. Bjørn, the CEO at Smart City Insights, has helped municipalities and companies in Scotland, the US, Australia, and France, just to name a few. He helps cities to unlock their ecosystem of data and to bridge the gap between public and private data. Anders, you will get another round. He's an associate professor, and it's only because of this name that comes now, in techno-anthropological studies and of digital knowledge organization at Aalborg University. And Anders is a founding partner of the Danish company Backscatter. Then from Aarhus, we have Sebastian Christoffersen, who is representing the city of Aarhus in the Nordic Smart City Network. Sebastian is innovation consultant at the Innovation Technology and Creativity Lab in Aarhus. And to begin with, we would like to give the word to you, Sebastian, to briefly present the project that you are looking into.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I'm representing the city of Aarhus, and we're a partner of this crowdsensing project together with Stavanger and Helsinki and Vejle and Copenhagen. And if we go a bit into the background of this project, then what is shared amongst the cities involved in this project is this that we can see the potential in this whole area of citizen science and crowdsensing, not just for generating insights about our cities, but also on this issue of citizen empowerment that we have been discussing in the previous session. So we have different projects already going on in these cities around crowd sensing or citizen science that we want to further expand upon. So for instance, we have more experience with the environmental sensing aspect of this, and Stavanger is also starting to get experiences with using wearables data from their citizens. So this combination of exploring what we can get of new insights of our city's health and also the citizens' health and well-being through the combination of environmental data and wearable data is something we want to explore further, and also just create awareness about these environmental conditions that can be in our cities, and also what, for instance, on the personal inactivity means for our cities, our citizens. So if we move on to a bit more what we want to do with this project, and it is to have this cross-Nordic collaboration where we share our experiences and do a shared crowd-sensing project together, where we want to test out 1 to 3 pilots that can either support urban planning, but also motivate our citizens into some of these societal challenges that we see in our cities. And then also, increase the data literacy and, of course, the empowerment aspect. So how we want to do this is that we have a first stage here in the autumn, where we want to take a more exploratory approach to it, where we want to learn from each other's existing projects, and also look beyond this and start getting a few hands-on experiments going on. And then in the spring 2021, we want to open up this project with open calls and get started developing one to three crowdsourcing campaigns that we want to scale up further after testing them in our cities, and then for 2 other Nordic countries, our cities, and then running a cross-Nordic competition to motivate our citizens into this. And then, of course, there's a evaluation period. So for this panel, it would be really interesting to get some perspectives on what you see the benefit of and also challenges with the crowdsensing and citizen science, especially to feed into this exploratory stage that we're going into now. So yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And Peter, Bjørn, I think I would actually like to start with you, because you have been involved in so many smart cities projects from the very early beginning when you start planning. And these projects where you are very much focused on the use of data, do you see some risk or some things you need to take into account from the very beginning in order to have a project that uses data not only to inform but also to create solutions?
Yeah, of course. I always, when I work with these cities around the world, I say let's just take a couple of steps back before we start to collect the data and use the data. So one of the projects I've been working on was in Hamilton in Canada, basically the size of Aarhus. And they defined a lot of these projects and challenges that they had and said, this is what we need to do, this is how we need to work. But then they said, we need to understand what does the citizens actually think about this. And there was a plan with that, because they also want the data from the citizens later on. But they actually consulted 50,000 citizens, and they did that by using different kinds of town hall meetings. We heard earlier about social media. They created apps, online consultations, all of these different kind of things. And then they revisited these different projects to say, what is the thing that's the most important for the citizens, just to get them motivated. And that's what was mentioned by Sebastian before. So that's one thing. The other thing is then to understand the challenge and the gap of information that you have. And I always say a little bit about, you need to have the overview. And this is where sensors, data from everything from mobile phones, social media, you get a pattern of what's happening in the city. And then you learn to understand the citizens' choices. So I normally do a project called Overview and Insights. So you have the overview, but who do you then need to talk to? Where are the problems? Where are the different patterns of how people react? And then you need to engage with anthropology and other things. We actually go and engage with the citizens in the right areas. And the big data are able to say, this is the area where you need to concentrate, because we can see a certain type of interaction, or these never come into the things we want them to come into. This is where we have a new project, who's using it, and then go out in the right areas of the city to try and understand what do you actually want, and also the ones not visiting and not being engaged, how can we get them engaged? And you can actually measure on these things with big data. So it's really about getting them engaged at an early stage, defining the problems, understanding it from the planning stage, and then with big data try to find out who is it that we need to speak to, and then of course speak to the citizens afterwards.
Thank you. But Vinay, when you then choose to use crowdsensing as a data collection, your experience in working with crowdsensing and maybe the opportunities and the pitfalls in that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So over the years we have tried different approaches where we have handed over sensor kits, we have handed over different types of data harvesting tools to people. And we specifically have a lot of domain expertise in environmental data, and that's something that we are very keen about. And we have realized there are certain advantages and there are certain disadvantages, as you rightly mentioned. The advantages that I see is that you can get rapid scale at very low cost, and that is something that is very appealing, I think, to a lot of stakeholders. And most importantly, you also get citizen engagement because you get active participation from the people who it matters the most to. And So those are definitely very powerful interests. The flip side of that story is that when you do cheap distributed sensing, especially in our domain, data quality becomes a really big issue. There are lots of challenges with regards to calibration of sensors, homogeneity of the data set, continuity of the data set. So as they typically say in classic computer science, garbage in, garbage out. It's so if you don't have a very strong hold on the data quality from get-going, it becomes a compounded issue that cannot be resolved easily at a later stage. There is, of course, a hypothesis that a large volume, so-called big data, of poor data quality is probably going to compensate itself than very accurate sensing methods. But that is not entirely true for many cases that we've seen. So I think there's a fine balance with regards to this idea of delivering citizen empowering tools in their own hands and amplifying that effect in different ways. Just to give you a practical example, one of the most common things that we have seen in our domain is counting the amount of fine particles in the air. And you can make a cheap kit that costs maybe less than $100 or something like that, equivalent of that, something like 600 kronas. You can also make something that's costing 18,000 kronas or 25,000 kronas. And there is a big difference between the two. And I think when you have to achieve scale, of course, it's very appealing to go cheap. And there is a problem in that inherently because you cannot compensate for data quality at a later stage in that particular domain. But there are other cases where you can have inexpensive solutions and you can harvest a lot of data.
Anders, this whole question about the quality of data and how do we work with that? Because of course, when you work with having all these different sources in, we have crowd sensing, you work with data collection from social media and so on. How do we work with this whole question about data quality and how do we address it? Yeah.
To me, I think, because I agree with most of what has been said, actually, that there are huge quality issues in a lot of these big data sets, but it's also, you should always judge the data in relation to the purpose that you use it for. So it's a kind of situated validity. So if you want to use data as an explorative tool, as Bjørn mentioned, to pick out the areas that you want to investigate further with more standardized methods, then it's good enough that it is a bit messy and but as long as it guides you to interesting questions, interesting field sites that you can go do interviews in. So that's one thing. And I think especially when you mentioned the continuity of the data is super difficult on social media, for instance, because the media has constantly changed their platforms. They change, whatever likes you can give. Suddenly you can give a heart, and then the like means something else. And so that changes. The conditions for using that data changes all the time, and it's very hard to make standards for using it the same way, this year, and then in 2 years it will be something completely different. So I agree with that. But then I'm really interested in, we call it participatory data design. And when we involve people in making data with us, it is actually, it's an engagement purpose we have. So when you involve people in suddenly measuring their own air quality around their house with their own sensor, then they suddenly realize that they have a lot of problems that are hidden in the aggregated maps of the municipality, because those maps are aggregated over a year, and suddenly when they have their own sensor, they realize it's the wood burning at the neighbor's house that is their problem. It's not the big road in their personal situation. And that makes them, we did an experiment with a 10th grade in Gentofte where they suddenly had a totally new perspective on their air problems because they had been using these personalized sensors. So I think it's a matter of what is the purpose of using data, and then you can judge the validity in relation to that, but do not discard any data sources without talking about the purpose, I think.
And also using data to in the support of creating healthy cities and so on. How can you also, we talked about it also earlier, how can you actually use that data to also early on get the user's understanding of, for example, what do we define as a healthy city? Because I think when sometimes when you create these projects, you have some prefixed terms that you put into this, but how can you use data to actually go out and do these investigations into what we actually as users understand of what a healthy city is?
I think to me, I think one thing that I would suggest is that when we talk about health data, that we're not just thinking about hard data as stemming from, for instance, Internet of Things and wearables and so on, because I think there's a lot of soft aspects to a healthy city. So you're not going for a run if you don't feel safe in your neighborhood, for instance. So, and people do leave a lot of traces of their sense of safety in neighborhoods that would be the precursor to even thinking about measuring their running activity, right? So that's one thing. And another thing is that actually a recent study in Nature showed that the biggest health problem in cities was what they called social evaluation stress. That you have problems fitting in all the symbols, and you need to perform in a certain way that you get high cortisol levels, you get stressed. And so it's not just about the noise of the cars and so on. There's also a lot of social things that goes into mental health that would be traceable on, for instance, social media. So I think we should think broader about what type of data can help us address health issues in cities.
Vinay, do you have a comment?
I have a lot of comments, but I think the most important thing that's worth mentioning is I think the purpose question, the balance between what data quality means what outcome. And I think that relationship mapping is not very well thought through in a lot of projects in advance. Usually it's something that is discovered along the way, and then people try to adjust to fit into that. Though I must say one more thing is that yes, there is a lot of soft data, but policies and regulation and the way decisions are made in cities typically rely on conforming to existing standards or things that are already preset in some sort of method that has already been pre-established, right? And those standards sometimes are counterproductive because they do not encourage crowdsourcing or vast data collection in its sort of construct of how it is. And again, coming back to a concrete example, this discussion about fine particles, it keeps coming back in our stream of work almost every week. And I just want to mention that you can crowdsource it for a cheap sensor. You can also buy what's called as a reference instrument that uses a filter paper, a gravitometric measurement method. And that's what's running, for example, in Jose Hanson's Boulevard, just around the corner from here, which costs several million kroners a year to run, just one measurement point, right? So I think if you take the same budget and spread it all over the city, if you had 1 million kroners to spend and you distributed a sampling kit, say, to all the citizens that you can get access to, would that provide better data to the city? This is something that I think is still unproven as a model. So I think there's a inherent hypothesis that we should be careful of, that just spreading a lot of data points does not automatically mean better decisions. So I think we should be cognizant of that fact and work with that idea. And this continuum between data quality and data volume, it's something that needs to be sort of very carefully addressed, case by case, use case by use case, I think.
Thank you. And Oliver, when you have then collected all this data, again, how do you actually ensure that you get that data engaged in a process where you actually create some solution or changing of policies and so on, so it doesn't become that, informative status of a sudden of a situation?
I think for me that goes a lot back to the need and the purpose of why we collect data. We don't collect data for the purpose of collecting data. We collect data because every morning we wake up, our city is either growing or shrinking. And we have the need for urban governance to help steer that super tanker of transformation. And if we're in Copenhagen, for example, then our city is growing. It's been growing for a while. And we do really need an opportunity to connect the governance of the city with the population of the city. And traditionally in urban planning, that link has become more and more severed. And I see great opportunities for urban planners in my generation now to be able to leverage technology solutions that we didn't have before to actually create a window between governance and population. And that's happening in small steps. So we have helped the city of Copenhagen, for example, before they formulated the last city development strategy, Fællesskab København, to actually through analysis of social media, doing things very similar to what you've described, to get a window into the sentiment of the people, how their everyday life hangs together. And that's for me the purpose of what we're doing. We're trying to improve positively people's everyday life in urban environments and responding to the dynamics that are at play. And they're complex. But there, for me, I think a really important lesson for Aarhus would be that don't just rely on big data. For me, it's in the combination of big data and thick data that I think your real strategies can emerge. So when we worked for Copenhagen, for example, we analyzed Facebook and Instagram data, but we at the same time sent ethnologists out to interview people for an hour and a half in every city district of Copenhagen. So it's about getting into depth and nuance with a select smaller group of people and being able to map trends and sentiments for the population at large.
Okay. And Peter Bjørn, you have been nodding, so if...
I agree.
Any comments also to what you hear? Do you disagree in anything that has been...
No, I very much agree with the data. What kind of data is we are looking at? Because if you look at particle and pollution, it's extremely important, it's correct. If you look at the flow of the city and to discover trends, it doesn't have to be that accurate. I think that's very important, that we really need to see what is it we're trying to measure here and why are we doing it, what do we need to use it for. So I think that's one of the key things, really, really important. I think the early engagement because we quite often go out and measure things and want the opinion of people of something already decided. So you go out and do the interviews. I think at an even earlier stage they need to be involved. You need to involve the citizens, like the thing I mentioned from Canada. And there's so many tools to use today to get that information, social media and apps and so on. I just still think we're quite often involving the citizens too late, not in your example, but when I see cities around the world, it's too late, because we already decided what we want to do, how we're going to do it, and then we need to involve the citizens to get the data by crowdsourcing data and so on. It needs to happen really, really early to have an impact, and figure out what is it they're really interested in, and then you can start to engage with them, and then they'll be willing to wearables and measure things as well.
Sebastian, you have now listened to some different perspectives. Thoughts on what you have been hearing today?
Yeah, so definitely the data quality aspect, we are also keenly aware of this, also from other projects. So we know, for instance, from Aarhus University, they have this big air quality project called Bertha. So we're learning from them, a technological institute also. So the whole calibration issue is, of course, something we're aware of on this environmental data aspect. But I think I agree with this, that it can be, that we should be aware of what we're using it for also. So this citizen empowerment and data literacy aspect. So even though data might diverge from the more scientific data, then that would also be a way to discuss data itself with citizens and then increase their awareness about that low-cost centers might have some issues with the data quality aspects as well. But it might be able to provide information on an indicative level, so we can explore those topics further, that there might be an issue, for instance, with the fireplaces next door that was brought up in this panel discussion. So yeah, and then I'm taking with me this, of course, that we should also provide soft data into this project, and maybe also social media to understand trends from these platforms as well. Something that I'm still curious about is on this trust issue and inclusiveness of citizens, because we don't really just want to approach the more tech-savvy citizens, so we also want to establish trust with a broader demographic group of our citizens. So any advice on this would also be really beneficial.
I think, Sebastian, that's where we figured out, if we just analyze Instagram and Facebook, then we're going to cut down the trichter of who we're going to speak to too radically. That's why we came up with the combination of big data and thick data. So we could actually dispatch ethnologists that were then speaking to homeless people. They were speaking to immigrants that don't have access to modern technology. So we could make sure that we have a more colorful palette of people around all social spectrums and interests, and engage those two through really traditional methods of getting data, like ethnologists do, and combining that then and setting that opposite what we read in social media. And I think it's then in the synthesis of how you bring these two together that allows you to cast a bigger perspective.
Vinay, you had a comment?
I just want to add that there's one very positive story around crowdsourcing large amounts of data, even at poor quality, is that there's a big gap between intent and action in most people's behavior. And this underlying sort of gap between the two can actually be interestingly deciphered. For example, if you're talking about people movement or I don't know, like their interest in outdoor spaces as an example, or their interest in traffic conditions. If you go do a qualitative assessment, everyone will say the right thing, more or less, because they have been culturally attuned to say the right thing. But if I ask you the simple question, how many times in a day or in a week do you take your car out? Most people will say, as little as possible, like one time maybe, right? And then you measure the data, supposing you have a logger on the car, and you measure it, of course there will be a slight discrepancy between the two, right? And if you can do this at scale and anonymously, I think you have a better opportunity of steering the qualitative assessments to get the right type of insight into real behavior of people rather than the assumed behavior of people. So I think there is a massive scope of crowdsourcing data, and I would carefully say this even at poor quality, because that insight is more valuable than just people's opinions. So I think there's a fine balance there, of course, but I think there is a positive story in crowdsourcing data there. Yeah.
I'll just throw it over to Peter Bjørn, and then Anders,
Yeah, just really quickly, it's from a city in Denmark where they had a project about cycling to school. They just put small stickers with a small sensor on it to say how many times are they cycling to school, to measure that. And that was the primary purpose of the project. But then they started to see, when did they leave, what routes did they take. So we thought they were all driving along this road, but they didn't. They actually took the more, I wouldn't say scenic, but safer route and these kind of things. So they start to get new insights they didn't actually thought they would have. So I think quite often, again, to measure these things have one purpose, and then try to think about it, we learned something new here. So and I think it's a very basic way to engage, and then what can you learn from it, which was positively received by the school and the parents and everything else as well. So it spun off new initiatives.
Okay, fantastic. Anders, you had a comment?
Yeah, I also just wanted to say that while I agree with all these quality issues, I also think there's a tendency to judge new crowd-sensed methods more harshly than established methods. So I think, speaking of sociology and ethnography, they have a long 100-year history, and some of the methods in those disciplines have been like staples of our way of analyzing society. So we almost forgot how problematic it is to make a survey, for instance, of asking people or even do modeling of air quality based on a few measuring stations in the city. So some methods come with a kind of an aura of validity that might not be justified. That's the deconstructivist in me wanting to pin that down a little bit. So I think we also need to remember that, and the crowd has always had a bad reputation as a source of knowledge. And I think it's worth to keep in mind, like, are we even judging these methods on the same quality criteria?
But how about that point that there is a quality issue in with crowd sensing and going on social media to collect data, that you narrow the demographic scope into the tech savvy. A comment to that?
That's true, and it's true in different degrees for different social medias in different countries. So that's also, social media use is super context specific. People use Facebook differently in Denmark than they do in England, and people at different ages even use Facebook differently when it comes to different issues. So it's like it's very hard to say. I mean, for some discussions, you actually have a pretty good sample of the Danes from Facebook, but you could of course never compete with the survey in terms of representativity when you use these kinds of methods. That would be stupid, right? So these methods can do something else, and of course you should not generalize where you cannot generalize.
And
One thing that's worth recognizing from the social media world, digital
services, is that most of them constantly self-evolve by continuously A/B testing their strategies. And this is something that cities, I don't see many cities doing that. Like it's you get a lot of informed opinions and you get consensus maybe, and then you sort of make decisions. It's never iterative cycle of constant trials. Like, of course, you can't do it with city infrastructure at scale, but small things, for example, opening time of schools, just as a small example, does it really impact quality of life for people? You know, like this can be iterated through a quick A/B test, and you can get data from a crowdsourced and sort of strategy to actually validate this for a neighborhood. And we don't see examples like that. And I think cities should really embark on sort of taking those learnings from digital platforms and transposing them into the real world. And not all of it is applicable, but I think there are some valuable lessons there. And I think also the difference between statistical methods, or let's call it more traditional methods, if that's one way of putting it, and let's call it more discrete mathematics, you know, like stuff that is as a continuum. It's never a one-point decision. It's a constant flow of decisions that happen. So I think there's a balance there, and that would be very interesting to transpose onto city policies and governance models if there was an opportunity, of course.
Yeah.
You know, just thinking about it, I think for me the opportunity lies there that it can help better leadership and better urban governance, because I think we can create new windows and channels for people at the top that make decisions to understand better who they're making decisions for. And I think it works that way in decision making. But we've also realized under COVID-19, we helped Frederiksberg municipality do public consultation where it kind of worked the other way around, where we could actually allow people to meet in space safely, to generate information that again is then given to city leadership to take a position about how they should invest money into public infrastructure. So I really do think it is about creating new channels of communication between people that make decisions. And sometimes it has to be super validated scientific information. Sometimes it's just about understanding better the population that you're making decisions for. So I think there's a range of benefits in working with crowdsourcing.
Yeah, perfect. Sebastian, last comment. You ensured that we had another round of discussion here based on your question there. So any last thoughts?
Just that anyone who has some input for us and maybe knows some great crowdsourcing cases, just send them my way, and we will take them into this exploration part of the project. And thanks for a really well run panel debate.
Thank you, Sebastian. And again, you're welcome also together with us to take this project into a further elaboration in a room of innovation, where we will look at this challenge from I think we could have used a 2-day workshop on this, really to strengthen the whole concept of the project and what to do, and all these discussions here. But thank you, and thank you so much for the panelists for taking the time to come here today. And from Urban Partnership here in BLOXHUB, we thank you all for joining us. And again, if you have some interesting ideas, perspectives on this challenge, please go to the chat function and list your name and your perspective, and then we will bring it forward. And also, if anyone of you out there sits with some interesting challenge that needs to be looked at from a cross-disciplinary approach, you're most welcome to contact us, and we will really like to get into a dialogue about working on a challenge with you guys. But I think that was it from our side, so thank you.